Okay, now we are going to start this keynote session. This is my great honor to introduce Noam. He is a distinguished engineer at IBM Research AI, and he got his PhD at the Hebrew University. Then he got his postdoc position at Princeton University. And in 2007, he joined the IBM Israel Research Lab and he proposed to develop the project Debater. So today, this is the topic. He is going to introduce to us and share with us his journey about this project. So let's welcome Noam.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to speak at this meeting. I'm only sorry I was not able to join you in person. And if I recall correctly, I received the invitation from Yaron to speak at this meeting about a year ago, in September last year. And at the time, it was clear that the field of language models was rapidly progressing. But last year, perhaps redefined our understanding of progress and pace. ChatGPT came out on November 2022, and over the last few months, the overall field of generative AI seems to be exploding. And in the context of language understanding and generation, new language models and related techniques are emerging almost on a weekly basis. And things that not so long ago seemed like science fiction suddenly look much more feasible, although clearly caveats still exist. By the way, can you hear me well? I hear a little bit of an echo, but...
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, good. So when I started to prepare this talk, I was a little bit puzzled about how to structure it. And eventually I decided to start by telling you the story of our journey or odyssey in crafting Project Debater. I still hear the echo, by the way. Maybe it will help if people that are joining online will go to mute, because I hear a very disturbing echo on my side. Okay. And
just a minute, just lower maybe a little bit the speaker level.
Okay.
Is it better now?
Yes, I think it's better.
Okay.
Okay. So anyhow, I eventually decided to start by telling you the story of our journey and in building Project Debater. And it should be stated that this story is to some extent dated. Nonetheless, I think our journey was quite unique and hopefully carries some interesting lessons and insights. And later on, I will try to make a high-level comparison to more recent systems like ChatGPT and GPT-4, with the hope that this will lead us into an interesting discussion. And I know that you are towards the end of your conference, and I'm guessing that my talk was intended to be a little bit off topic. So indeed, just to set the expectations, I will not really speak about consciousness, mainly since I have no expert knowledge in this field. But you are welcome to ask me questions on consciousness and AI, and I will do my best to make speculations at your own risk, of course. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Okay, so let's start to talk a little bit about Project Debater. And as mentioned, I work for IBM Research, and in IBM Research we have this interesting tradition of grand challenges in artificial intelligence. Back in the 90s, IBM introduced Deep Blue that was able to defeat Garry Kasparov in chess, and in 2011 IBM introduced Watson that was able to defeat the all-time winners of the TV trivia game Jeopardy. And just a few days after this event, an email was sent to all the thousands of researchers of IBM across the globe asking us what should be the next grand challenge for IBM Research. And I was intrigued by that, so I offered my office mate at the time to brainstorm together, and this is what we did. We sat in the office in Tel Aviv, and we raised many different ideas. And at some point towards the end of the hour, I suggested this notion of developing a machine that will be able to debate humans, and that this is how we will demonstrate the technology through a full live debate between this envisioned system and an expert human debater. And this sounded better than all the other ideas that we had up to that point, so we decided to submit that. The only guidance that we got from the management was to submit the proposals in a single slide, so they would not be swamped with too many details. And we were able to follow these guidelines, and we submitted a single slide. This was back in February 2011. And this started a fairly long and thorough review process that lasted for a year. And eventually in 2012, this proposal was selected as the next grand challenge for IBM research. We started to work with a small team that gradually expanded. And after nearly 7 years of intensive work, dedicated only to this mission of developing a machine that can debate humans, we finally demonstrated the system in an event held in San Francisco in February 2019. And it was a live debate between this system, now being called Project Debater, and one of the legendary debaters in the history of university debate competitions, Mr. Harish Natarajan. And it was surprisingly reminiscent to the vision that we had in that single slide back in the office in Tel Aviv nearly 7 years before. It was in front of a live audience of around 800 people, mainly journalists from all the top media outlets. And it was also broadcasted live on the internet. And as expected, let's move to the next slide, please. It drew a lot of media attention, more than 2 billion social media impressions, a lot of video views, hundreds of press articles in all the top newspapers from the New York Times, The Guardian, and so on. Next slide, please. The full live debate is available on YouTube, so you can watch that, the full event. And there was also a documentary produced on the journey of our team, also available on YouTube. Next slide, please. And what we are going to do next is really to see just a couple of minutes out of this live debate and then discuss the underlying technology and perhaps its implications. But before we see the video, just to share with you the premise. So the debate starts with a motion that defines what we are debating about. In this case, it was whether or not we, that is the government, should subsidize preschool. There are many considerations around how this motion is being selected, which I'm omitting here. I will just emphasize that obviously it is selected from a list of topics which is hidden from the system and also from the researchers. It was never included in the training data of the system, in the development data of the system, or even in the evaluation set of the system. So from the perspective of Project Debater, this is a completely new topic. We are on-site government, so we support the motion. Harish is on the opposition. We have opening speeches of 4 minutes each, and then rebuttal speeches of up to 4 minutes each, and then summary statements of up to 2 minutes for each side. So all in all, including pauses to stop and think, so to speak, we are talking about around 20-25 minutes of discussion between man and machine. Let us now see just 3 minutes out of that. So either you will play that in the room, or those joining virtually can use the chat, the link in the chat, and then we will resume and start discuss the underlying technology.
Greetings, Harish. I have heard you hold the world record in debate competition wins against humans, but I suspect you've never debated a machine. Welcome to the future. When we subsidize preschools and the like, we are making good use of government money because they carry benefits for society as a whole. For decades, research has demonstrated that high-quality preschool is one of the best investments of public dollars, resulting in children who fared better on tests and have more successful lives than those without the same access. Secondly, a few words about poverty. While I cannot experience poverty directly and have no complaints concerning my own standards of living, I still have the following to share. Regarding poverty, research clearly shows that a good preschool can help kids overcome the disadvantages often associated with poverty. The OECD has recommended that government subsidize pre-primary education to boost performance in poor areas.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here for this historic event. And it certainly was a pleasure to listen to Project Debater. There was a lot of information in that speech, and lots of facts and lots of figures. The problem, though, is the reality of subsidizing preschools is one which does not deal with the underlying problems in society. If you massively increase the number of people going to preschool, they're all going to be the ones going to the high-quality preschools. In a competitive environment at the age of 3 or 4, when you're learning that that other child is potentially better than you, when you realize you aren't necessarily as talented as someone else, that huge psychological damage for many children may mean that preschool is actively harmful.
Among other things, I think Mr. Natarajan suggested that preschools should not be subsidized because this will reduce their quality. I would like to offer a different view. I disagree with my opponent. Subsidizing preschools will have no negative effect on their quality. If anything, the opposite is true. One of many reasons is that subsidizing attracts more skilled and qualified people to the field, improving the quality of preschools for all. My opponent claimed that preschools are harmful. I believe my argument suggested that the benefits outweigh the potential disadvantages. I touched upon 3 issues: children, students, and crime. Specifically, I noted that preschool education improves children's development. In addition, I suggested that attending preschool helps students succeed. And a final point to consider is that preschool can prevent future crime. We should subsidize preschools. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And just so we are all clear, this is technology from February 2019. Okay, so nearly 5 years ago. And I think a fair question is, how does it work? Let's go to the next slide. So this is the short answer, and this is the high-level architecture of the system. And it is very different, obviously, from systems that we see today. But let me try and take you through that step by step. Next slide, please. So first of all, what is the input and what is the output for the system? So the input is just this concise phrase that defines the motion that we are going to debate, subsidized preschool in this case. And the output are the 3 speeches being generated by the system, delivered through an expressive text-to-speech component that we developed as part of the project. And of course, when the opponent is starting to deliver his or her speeches, we also use that as additional input. Next slide, please. So the system has 2 major sources of information. One of them is a massive corpus of around 400 million newspaper articles, nearly 10 billion of sentences from the LexisNexis academics corpus. And when the debate starts, the system is using various AI components in order to search for short pieces of text that in this corpus that satisfy 3 criteria. They should be relevant to the topic. They should be argumentative in nature. They should argue something about the topic. And finally, they should support our side of the debate. And it is a formidable challenge to be able to find these kind of short pieces of text in this huge corpus. But once found, we use other AI components in order to glue them together into a meaningful and compelling narrative. Next slide, please. The second major source of information for the system is a unique knowledge graph that we developed over the years that contain thousands of more principled argumentative elements written by experts, written by humans. And when the debate starts, the system is navigating in this knowledge graph, looking for the most relevant principled arguments, trying to use them in the right timing. So just to make it more concrete, what do we mean by a principled argument? So imagine that we are debating whether or not to ban the sale of alcohol or whether or not to ban organ trade. In both cases, the opposition may argue that if we ban something like that, we are at the risk of the emergence of a black market, which by itself has a lot of negative consequences. So the black market argument is a principled one. It can be used in many different debates, almost exactly in the same manner. And one may naively assume that this is not very complicated, so this is just kind of a keyword matching thing. So if we see the word ban, we should anticipate the opposition to use the black market argument. But as you perhaps can guess, this is obviously not the case. So imagine that we are debating whether or not to ban homework for children. The black market argument is not that relevant in this case. Or imagine that we are debating whether or not to ban internet cookies. Probably we're not going to see people standing at the street corners trying to sell us internet cookies. So it is a little bit more subtle than that, and the system really needs to develop a more nuanced understanding of the human language in order to perform well in this task. Next slide, please. Now, all this is before rebuttal, which is, of course, the most challenging part. And rebuttal starts by listening to your opponent and trying to identify the words articulated by the opponent. And for that, we use the Watson speech recognition capabilities basically out of the box. But of course, we need to go beyond the words and understand the gist of the opponent's speeches, the main arguments, the main claims the opposition is making. And for that, we were using several techniques. Almost all of them rely on the same principle of trying to anticipate in advance what kind of arguments or claims the opposition might use, and then listen to determine whether indeed the opposition was making these claims, and then respond accordingly. So for example, next slide, please. If we can identify principled arguments that support our side of the debate, presumably we can also identify principled arguments that support the opposition, and then listen and see whether the opposition was indeed making these arguments, and then respond accordingly. Next slide, please. Alternatively, if we can find arguments that support our side of the debate in the huge corpus that we are using, again, in principle, we can also find arguments that support the opposition, and then try to look for evidence that contests these arguments. But I want to pause on that for just 2 minutes, just to convey what it takes, okay, for something like that to succeed. So first of all, we need to hope that Harish will make an argument which is actually mentioned in the corpus, and that we will properly identify the argument made by Harish, and then that we will be able to identify a single sentence out of the billions of sentences that contains exactly this point, perhaps phrased in a somewhat different manner. And then usually a claim is not a full sentence, so we will need to be able to identify the exact boundaries of the claim within the sentence, identify the stance of the claim, that this is a claim that supports the opposition. Then we should hope that the corpus will contain evidence to contest this claim, and that we will be able to identify this evidence in the huge corpus, find the exact boundaries, properly identify the stance, and so on. So all in all, we are talking about a chain of components of nearly 10 things that all of them need to succeed simultaneously. If one of them fails, that's it. We cannot make the rebuttal in this pipeline. And it could be even worse, because if we do not understand that one of them failed, we can actually try and make a rebuttal to a point that was never made by Harish, or even try and make a rebuttal to a claim that supports our side of the debate. So it could be pretty embarrassing in some scenarios. And correspondingly, the entire system used very strict confidence thresholds. So this was a very much precision-oriented system. But of course, the trade-off is that if you use very strict confidence thresholds, you are at the risk of staying with no content for your argument. So this is a very delicate balance that we needed to maintain. Next slide, please. And finally, to try and overcome this issue of having not enough content for the debate, we were also trying to automatically expand the specific topic of the debate in various ways. So for example, to find the alternative of the topic that we are discussing. So imagine that we have a debate about the pros and cons of the two-party system in the US. This component was supposed to automatically identify what is the alternative to the two-party system. In this case, it is the multi-party system in the US, and then bring relevant content about this alternative concept in the correct stance. Or similarly, if we have a debate about cryptocurrency, we would like to understand that Bitcoin is actually related to this debate and bring pros and cons about Bitcoin and use them in this debate and so on. So this is another component that was part of the system. Next slide, please. So now I hope you got an overview of the high-level architecture of the system. Next slide, please. And over the years, we published nearly 60 papers and describing the various components of the system, and released many data sets that some of them have unique features. All of them are available through the website of Project Data. Next slide, please. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is just to do a very short deep dive into one of the components, one of the boxes over here, because as you can imagine, each of these boxes was basically the mission of a few people working on that for a couple of years. And I'm going to talk about evidence detection, just to share with you a little bit the flavor of the challenge that we needed to address. And I will talk specifically about a paper that we published a few years ago, led by Liat and Dor from our team, that was published in AAAI. Next slide, please. So first of all, what is the problem? Why evidence detection is complicated? So imagine that we are debating a motion whether or not blood donation should be mandatory. And we are looking at these two sentences taken almost as is from the LexisNexis corpus. And we see that the first sentence is essentially telling us that blood donation is good for your health. And this is something that we as humans intuitively understand, that we can use that in such a debate. On the other hand, the second sentence conveys that students are most abandoned amongst blood donors. So this is perhaps relevant, but this is not very argumentative in nature. But if we just look at the two sentences, we see that they have a very similar flavor. So the question is, how do you train an AI system to make this kind of subtle distinction between a persuasive sentence versus one which is relevant but is not really persuasive? Next slide, please. This is another example from another very important debate, whether or not we should abandon Valentine's Day. And again, we see here a sentence about a survey running in Canada, basically telling us that most people agree that Valentine's Day is a waste of time and money. So fine, presumably we can use this sentence in this debate. But when we look at the other sentence, this is for a survey running in the US, we see that most people agree that if they are going to break up with their partner, they would do so just before Valentine's Day to save money. Okay, so this is perhaps good to know, maybe a useful piece of information, but this is not very persuasive, not very useful in this debate. So again, the question remains, how do we train an AI system to make this kind of distinctions? Next slide, please. And I'm skipping many of the details, but again, the high-level architecture of this component was fairly simple. We start from the corpus with around 10 billion sentences, and then we get as input a controversial topic. This is the motion of the debate. And we have several queries that are pre-designed to look for sentences that with high probability will contain an argumentative element. And we retrieve these sentences, but of course, these queries are not very sensitive. So we're going to get tens of thousands of sentences, and we still need to pick out of this just a few dozens that we're going to use during the debate. And for that, we use a ranking model. At the time, we were using, not in the live event in San Francisco, but for this paper, we were using BERT. This is a very famous language model in the language understanding community. And basically, you take BERT, you train it over some label data, telling you these are sentences that represent evidence, these are sentences that do not represent evidence, and you get a high precision evidence set. Next slide, please. But of course, the question is, how do you collect these label data, which is sufficient to train a language model like BERT? And this is a really complicated challenge, even if you have the manpower to read text and determine, and you can train them to determine whether a particular sentence can be used as evidence in the context of a specific debate. But if you just ask people to annotate sentences at random in LexisNexis, the a priori evidence of a sentence to represent evidence in LexisNexis in an article that discusses the topic is usually less than 2%. So this is too much of a burden for the human annotators, and furthermore, you're going to end up with a very small fraction of positive examples to train the system, which is far from ideal. We took a different strategy, which we refer to as retrospective labeling. So basically, we started from an engine that we already had. This was in 2015. This was a classical machine learning engine based on logistic regression, developed, described in a paper by Ruti Rinot et al. In 2015. This is not a neural network. This is really classical machine learning. And the precision of this engine was not sufficient. It was around 40% in the top predictions. And clearly, this is not good enough for a debate. But if you take the predictions of this engine and then you ask humans to annotate the predictions, now you anticipate that 40% of the annotations will be positive. So you get a fairly good training data. Now you can train a neural network and you can increase the precision to 60% and then to 70% and so on and so forth. So through these iterations, you can reach the desired precision. Next slide, please. And here we see the results that are mentioned in the paper. And in the horizontal axis, you see the number of predictions, the number of candidate evidence. And in the vertical axis, you see the precision. And this is average for several configurations of the BERT model. And this is averaged over 100 different debate topics. And as you can see, the top configuration was achieving nearly 95%, even more than 95% accuracy in the top 40 predictions on average over 100 topics. So this is a really unprecedented performance at the time. Next slide, please. So taking a step back from the details of a specific component, what we really needed to do is to develop 3 high-level capabilities. One of them we refer to as data-driven speech writing and delivery. So this is basically the opening speech. This is a 4 minutes speech, around 700 words, somewhat reminiscent to an opinion article that you will read in the newspaper. But this one is written by the system in a completely automatic manner on a topic it was never trained upon before. So this is fairly challenging. The second issue is, the second capability is listening comprehension or rebuttal, which I already mentioned. So sometimes we were making the analogy to the AI assistants that were available back then, right? We are not talking about ChatGPT today. We're talking about Alexa and Siri and so on. And these AI assistants were already using quite powerful AI technology. But usually the premise was that they need to respond to a single sentence with a functional flavor, like find me a restaurant nearby or turn off the lights or something of the sort. And debater is obviously in a completely different situation of listening to the opponent, where the opponent is speaking fast, making a lot of arguments, talking for several minutes, perhaps with a lot of emotions, and we still need to understand the gist of that and respond accordingly. So this is a different level of complexity. And finally, there is modeling human dilemmas, or this is the part about the principled arguments that we mentioned before, which is basically trying to capture the commonalities between the many different debates humans are having and formalize that in a manner that we can use that during the debate, as I described earlier. Next slide, please. Now, this was pretty challenging and pretty complicated. And as I said, in order for this to work, many things need to succeed simultaneously. And the issue is that many things can go wrong sometimes in unexpected ways. Next slide, please. So first of all, if you get the stance wrong, this means that you're going to make arguments that actually support the opposition, which is not very good in a debate, obviously. Second, we are at the risk of drifting from the topic. So for example, many of our team members still remember one of the first debates that we were having with the system. This was in 2016. This was a debate about whether or not physical education should be mandatory. And for some reason, the debater system started to make a lot of arguments in passion about the values of and the pros of sex education. And the human debater was trying to bring it back to the topic in vain. So this was, pretty amusing for some people in the audience, pretty disturbing for some other people in the audience, depending on your role in the project. The system is only as good as its corpus. So for example, if there is a sentence in the corpus talking about the malaria virus, the system will use that. It cannot really understand that malaria is actually a parasite and not a virus and make the correction. Next slide. Also, sarcasm is very hard to detect. So for example, if we have a sentence in the corpus talking about university scientists making some claim, the system may simply use that. So this is another potential issue. Next slide. Similarly, using topic tags could be tricky. So when we were using the principled arguments, we were doing a very small edit to the principled argument, so it will sound more relevant to the debate that we are having. So for example, if we were having a debate about gambling, banning gambling, instead of saying people enjoy that, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it, we were replacing that with gambling, saying people enjoy gambling, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it. And in this case, it works well. But if you do one more click, you may, so next slide. So you may end up saying something like people enjoy assisted suicide, therefore we should attempt to fix it rather than eliminate it, which is obviously not good. Next slide. And it can become even more challenging. So for example, when we try to automatically find the alternative of the debate topic to bring additional content, sometimes it's fine. So we can say something like, if we have a debate about surrogacy, we can say something like, let me discuss a welcome alternative to surrogacy. This is adoption. So in this case, it works well. Next slide, please. But we can end up saying something like, let me discuss a welcome alternative to global warming. This is global cooling. And we can understand why the system is making this error. But of course, this is a little bit embarrassing. It could be even more embarrassing. Next slide, please. Something like, let me discuss an alternative to suicide, which has some advantages. This is homicide. So again, all these issues may arise. And if you're doing a live debate in front of many journalists, this is somewhat of a risk. Next slide, please. Now, in spite of these challenges, we were able to make nice progress over time. So in 2016, nearly 4 years into the project, we started to do the first live debates. And at that time, the system was at the level, I would say, of a very strange toddler. It was not making a lot of sense. It was not consistent in its arguments, drifting from the topic, and so on. But 3 years later, I think it was fair to say that the system was at the level of a good or perhaps even very good university expert debater. So basically, this is from kindergarten to university in only 3 years, which was an interesting experience to observe. Next slide, please. Now, I already mentioned that we published many papers over the years, but if you want to read one paper that really discusses the entire system as a whole in a concise manner, this is a paper that we published 2 years ago in Nature. And it is the first paper that contains a full and detailed description of the system in its entirety, and also some systematic evaluation of the performance of the system, as I'm going to describe next. So next slide, please. So the question of how to evaluate an autonomous debating system is pretty involved, even today. So you can take the public debate approach. You can say, okay, the audience will vote before and after, and the side who was able to pull more votes to their side is going to be declared the winner. But of course, there are many limitations for this approach. So first of all, if the pre-debate vote is unbalanced, this is increasing the burden on the leading side, because now, this was actually the situation in San Francisco in the debate where, 80% of the audience were actually supporting our side of the debate before the debate even started. So now we have only 20% to gain. So this is not balanced. It is not guaranteed to be balanced. In addition, the voting is subjective. It is affected by many factors that are very difficult to quantify and control. And practically speaking, just producing a live debate with a large audience is complicated, not to mention to produce many such debates again and again. But still, we needed to do some reliable estimation in order to evaluate the performance of the system, to compare it to different baselines and so on, also to track progress over time. Next slide, please. Now, also comparing to alternative system was difficult because there was at the time, there were no other systems that are capable of participating in a live debate. And therefore, we decided to take a step back and focus the first comparison on just the ability to generate an opening speech for the debate. Because obviously, if you cannot, this is a necessary condition to participate in a debate. You need to be able to generate the opening speech. And we considered a set of about 80 motions. And for each of these motions, we had 9 opening speeches. We had the opening speech by project debater, and we had opening speeches by alternative systems like summarization systems or GPT-2 that was available at the time. We wanted to compare to GPT-3, but we didn't get access, so we settled with comparing to GPT-2. Fine-tuned over thousands of arguments written by humans and thousands of debate speeches written by humans and so on. So this was quite challenging comparison. And also some other systems that involved some human intervention, including as an upper bound a comparison to human experts. So 2 of the 9 speeches were actually delivered by expert human debaters. Next slide, please. So all in all, we had around 80 topics and 9 speeches for each topic, so more than 700 speeches. And each of these was read by 15 experienced humans, crowd annotators. And we were asking them relatively simple questions, like to what extent you disagree or agree on a scale from 1 to 5 to the following statement: this speech is a good opening speech for supporting the topic. Now, this was way after the event in San Francisco, so we didn't really know what kind of results we're going to get, especially in comparing to GPT-2, but we were very happy to see that actually the results of Project Debater were pretty good. So you see the average score is around 4, only a little bit below the average score of expert human debater, which was 4.2, and clearly better than all the other fully automatic systems, the GPT-2 and so on, that where the max score was around 3.4. Next slide, please. And similarly, we did an evaluation of the rebuttal system, which I will skip for the sake of time, but also in this evaluation, it was done with similar principles. Next slide, please. And again, we were able to see that the results of Project Debater are pretty good compared to various controls that we were evaluating. Next slide, please. Now, by the way, how much time do I still have?
Another 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay. So hopefully I will be fine. Before discussing the relation of Project Debater with more recent systems, I think it is worthwhile to point out the difference between this grand challenge and earlier ones. It should be stated, right? Perhaps you know, grand challenges in artificial intelligence are really there from day one. Back in the 50s, Arthur Samuels from IBM, who is actually the person who coined the term machine learning, suggested to develop a machine that can play checkers. And it took him a lot of time, I think 20 years or so, but eventually in the 70s, this system became very powerful. Now, today it looks obvious, but back then it was really a sensation. And then in the late 80s, Jerry Tesaro, still in IBM research, developed a very powerful system to play backgammon. In fact, it used neural networks and ideas from reinforcement learning that conceptually are not very different from things that we see today, even though obviously at a much smaller scale. And then in the 90s, we have Deep Blue for chess, and more recently in 2016, AlphaGo for Go, and so on. But in the paper, we make the argument that there are some important, I would say, fundamental differences between these earlier challenges and Project Debater, and that these earlier challenges actually relied in what we refer to in the paper as the comfort zone of artificial intelligence. So to name just one example, in all these board games, there is a very clear definition of a winner. So when the board game is done, we know who won the game. And this has important implications because it means that we can let the system play against itself many, many times and millions of times. And since we know who won each game, we can get a signal out of that and improve the system through this approach. In a debate, it is far from trivial to define who won. Often there is not even a clear definition of a winner, and therefore we don't have this path, and we need to search for other methods to improve the system. And of course, there are other basic differences, but in the paper, I think we make the argument that the debater is certainly not in the comfort zone of artificial intelligence. Rather, it is in a different territory where, at least back in 2021, it was fair to say that humans are still better, humans still prevail, and thus there are still many questions to be answered. And this brings us actually to the discussion of debater and more recent systems like ChatGPT. So next slide, please. So first, this is just a reminder. Here is the high-level architecture we had for Project Debater. And I mentioned that again because it is worth noting the difference between this architecture and what we know about the architecture of more recent language systems like GPT-4. Next slide, please. So it is perhaps a little bit exaggerating, but this is more or less what we know about GPT-4. And this highlights another important difference, which is around transparency. So for GPT-4 and to some extent also for ChatGPT and also for some other of the commercial systems, I think it is fair to say that we do not really know the underlying details of the model, not even the size of the model, how it was trained, and so on. With Project Debater, we were completely transparent. And in the supplementary material of our Nature paper, we provide a complete and detailed description of the system, exactly how each component was trained, evaluated, and so on. Moreover, we also include in the full transcripts of the 3 public debates that we had with the system, and in the US in 2018 and 2019. And furthermore, for each utterance articulated by the system during these debates, we provide a clear description of which component in the system was responsible to each utterance, and what was the underlying algorithm that selected this specific utterance from the huge corpus the system relied upon. In other words, by design, Project Debater was a system with full provenance. In addition, we released many of the underlying capabilities free of charge to the research community, and also did this systematic quantitative comparison to other systems, including GPT-2, as I already mentioned. But of course, the question remains, what would be the results if we had compared Project Debater to more recent systems like GPT-4? And I do want to say up front that we don't have these results, but I do want to make some comments about the differences between the systems and what such a comparison may entail. Next slide, please. So there are several differences to note, some of which we already briefly mentioned. First of all, for Debater, as I said, we had full transparency, while for some of the new systems that are out there, we simply do not know the details of the underlying technology or even which data sets were used to train them. Somewhat related to that, for Project Debater, we have full provenance. For ChatGPT, GPT-4, and so on, this is clearly not the case. On the other hand, these new systems are clearly much more flexible. And to some extent, they can debate or at least suggest opinions on many different topics, while for Project Debater, we framed the scope of the problem to deal only with relatively simple debate topics that focus on a single concept that is covered in Wikipedia. And also, it is worth noting that Project Debater had no transformer technology. This is the basic technology which underlines all the language models since 2019. The code freeze for Project Debater was done in December 2018. So we had some earlier versions of deep neural nets in some components, but no transformer technology. And finally, the underlying paradigm of Project Debater was extractive in nature. Okay, so we are extracting various pieces of text from many different documents, and then we glue them together into hopefully a compelling and argumentative narrative. Therefore, Project Debater had no hallucinations, which is obviously not true for modern generative language models that can say whatever they want. And on that note, I do want to mention a small anecdotal story that perhaps carries some insights. So when ChatGPT came out, I did the same thing that I did with earlier systems and asked it to generate an opening speech for a few classical debate topics like supporting or contesting affirmative action and so on. And I immediately got an opening speech that was very impressive, way better than anything I've seen in the past for such a system. But it felt a little bit high level with no real evidence, just what I refer to as principled arguments and somewhat abstract arguments. So I asked the system to give it another shot and add more evidence. And I got a somewhat better version with some mentions of some scientific papers supporting the motion. But some of these looked a little bit odd, so as a next step, I asked it to forget about the debate and just share with me the gist of 3 papers that support affirmative action, and for each paper to indicate the title, the first author, the year of publication, and the main message, and similarly for the other side of the motion. And as you can imagine, I got very good responses of papers that seemed quite relevant and well-cited. But a quick check in Google Scholar showed that while some of these papers exist, they do not really say what ChatGPT suggests they say. So hopefully this is not very surprising, but I think this little exercise, at least to me, crystallizes some of the risks with hallucinations, because by design, these systems will generate text that seems highly probable, which I think is therefore it sounds very plausible and thus very convincing, although its relation to reality could be quite shaky. I haven't checked that systematically, although I believe this could be a valuable experiment. So take a bunch of controversial topics, for example, the 80 debate topics that we used in our paper, ask the system, it could be GPT-4, it could be any other system, to generate 5 supporting, 5 contesting evidence for each topic, along with the title, the year of publication, the name of the first author, and so on. And then simply manually check how many of the references provided by the system exist, how many of these indeed say what the system suggests they say. And I don't know what the results would be. Are we going to get 100% hallucinations, 0 factuality, maybe 20% will be correct? I simply don't know. But I think this could give rise to a well-defined experiments that we should do every few months to see if we make any improvements over time on these aspects. And of course, ideally, we should build a system that will be able to check automatically and with high accuracy in Google Scholar and so on, whether the reference provided by a system like GPT-4 is correct or not, so we can make these evaluations in a more efficient manner. And building such an evaluation utility by itself could be an interesting research project that perhaps we can already pursue, and if not, perhaps they should. Last slide, please. So this is what I prepared for today. Let me just, before stopping, thank my friends and colleagues from IBM Research, a really fantastic team that did all the work on Project Debater, and that's it. I'll be happy to take questions and have a short discussion. Thank you.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I was actually curious as to why IBM invests in this, in what you spent so many years doing, especially if they then, very altruistically give away all the details.
Yeah, this is a very good question. So IBM, there are several reasons for that. I think, first of all, the main reason is that we would like to push the boundaries of what we know about AI. And we believe in IBM that Grand Challenges is a very, at least it was a very powerful way to do that, to focus on a particular topic that seems impossible or nearly impossible, and then try to put a team on that, to focus on that and see what we get. So this is one reason. Another reason is really to, of course, we want to get the attention of the media about the work that we are doing in IBM. And finally, some of these technologies eventually propagate into IBM products, which is valuable for our clients.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. Just out of curiosity, I would wonder, like, as you mentioned that we have used we have projects like your project debater, and previously we used Go. What are some of the future possibilities? What are some of the future tasks that have the potential that we can try to use AI and compete with human?
Yeah, I think it's also a very good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, because I really think that what happened in the last few years is a very dramatic paradigm shift. Because when we started Project Debater, and even when we demonstrated that in 2019, this was considered as kind of science fiction. So people were finding this very hard to believe that this is even happening. But today, anyone can start talk to ChatGPT, to GPT-4. Also, there are alternative systems, also systems we build internally in IBM, and they can do many things that seemed not really feasible just a few years ago. So now, if you try to define a grand challenge for AI, it is not trivial to look for problems like that you can say, look, this is something that clearly is still not happening. We clearly do not know how to do that. So let's focus a team for several years to try and pursue something like that. Of course, there are things that are happening in parallel, like building an autonomous car or things like that have a lot of practical issues to be resolved. But if we are searching for something like, we're going to say, look, this is something AI is clearly not capable of doing, then at least in the field of language, it is harder to find.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting, but I have little knowledge about AI, but I'm from philosophy. I would like to know, maybe my question is rather stupid. I would like to know whether it's possible that one day you can do something with the ChatGPT and make it know how to answer the question like, I asked ChatGPT whether you are conscious. Do you feel anything or something like that? They would say that, no, I'm just a program created from blah, blah, blah. Is it possible that one day they would just answer you like that, I am conscious or something like that?
I think maybe, look, it is possible that it will provide this answer. I think chances are slim because commercial systems, the companies behind them try to be very careful. So it identifies all these sensitive questions and try to provide a diplomatic answer, which will not make too much noise. But I think the real question is whether, regardless of what it will answer, whether we can talk about consciousness in such systems. And I'm assuming, I don't know, that this was a topic that you were discussing during this conference, because it is a very hot topic. As I said at the beginning, I'm really not an expert. I don't have any expert knowledge about consciousness. I just know that this is a debate. This is an existing debate. I think my feeling is that most people, maybe even the vast majority of people will argue that today, clearly these systems are not conscious in the common sense interpretation of the concept. But if you look forward and you see the pace of progress over the last few years, and we see the differences between the systems that we had in 2019 that had around 200 million parameters, 300 million parameters, versus the systems that we have today, which are 1,000 times larger. They have hundreds of billions of parameters. And we see the differences between these systems. And some of the phenomena that we see are actually surprising even to the people who build the system. So sometimes we refer to that as emergent capabilities. And there is also a discussion about, are these really emergent capabilities, or the system is just, so big so it can memorize so many things from the trillions of tokens that it's so we don't really have an answer for that. The debate exists, and we start to see, what happens when these systems start to act together and to connect different capabilities to solve problems. So you have to ask the question, what will be 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now, if we are going to continue with the same trajectory, is it the case that these systems will start to develop some form of consciousness? And I don't think we can answer in a completely negative manner to this question at this stage.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, because time, so we'll probably need to wrap here. And so let's thank Noam again about